Adam, welcome back. Welcome back on the keys to AWS optimization. Thank you for joining us today. How's everything going?
Thanks, John. Excited to be here. Kind of long overdue topic to get into, so ready to dive deep.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this one. We've been talking about this for a while, and excited to kind of go into a couple of different areas of generative AI and really where that like intersects with everything that we do in the FinOps world. Before we get into that, Steph is out. For folks that are just joining us today for the first time, this is the keys to AWS optimization, the show where we share solutions, concepts, and stories that help you unlock cost savings and cost optimization on AWS. And like Adam and I were just saying, today's topic, we're going to be going through and talking about generative AI and how this overlaps with the FinOps world. So a couple different places that we're going to kind of jump in and explore this from both like cost optimization as well as different tasks that we're doing in FinOps roles. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves there too much. My name is John Massey, and I'm a principal optimization solutions architect on the optics team here at AWS. And Adam, you want to give another background? I know you're a frequent face on the show, but maybe for folks who hadn't heard from you before, just give us the background story on yourself.
Yeah, happy to. So Adam Richter here, a senior optimization solutions architect on team with John. So we work together quite a bit on a lot of projects inside of AWS. Worked at AWS for a little over 5 years, and I've kind of had a mix of public and private sector roles throughout my history. So I enjoy really like the technical topics and getting into solving problems. Like I enjoy working on things that we can move the needle for customers or move the needle for a solution for a business. So that's really where my passion is.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of those places where it's been cool seeing generative AI and how you're able to use the tools, and what different places there are that those kind of fit in with like day-to-day tasks as well as kind of more head-on with optimization related things. We're obviously seeing a ton of demand from customers, a lot of different offerings from the AWS side, different customer objectives that folks are tackling now, and it's just a wide scope that lends itself to a lot of different places to explore and start to poke and prod at where we can help us as well as where we can bring value. And that was the cool part that got me excited about this show, Adam, was, you were one of the ones where it was really early on, just talking about some of the work you have been doing with LLMs and, even just playing around with it. I think, everyone had a chance to, get excited about some of those capabilities, but you had been sharing some really neat stuff with me, early on last year. It was just getting us excited about the opportunities to use it for FinOps. But I'm curious if you want to just share maybe a little bit of background, kind of how you got started in that space. What did it look like, and anything for the audience there.
Yeah, I've got kind of like a little bit of a long history with AI. I first became interested in it way back in 2005 when I was working with a group of like financial investors and really savvy folks. They had all these trading strategies and they wanted to find someone to help design those things into a program that could automatically perform trades according to those rules. And I offered to help them out. I had enough technical chops at the time, at least to throw some code together. And it was really fun. Gave them the ability to, instead of having to be there to kind of follow the rules manually, it would just follow the rules programmatically. They could use that to go do testing and determine if it was really even a successful strategy. And the more I helped them, the more I realized the scale of this thing and all the indicators, the variables. It was just too much for like an individual person to try to put together into a strategy. And I, at the time, picked up a book on AI because I realized, hey, AI maybe can help me here. Maybe I could point something smarter than me at this, and they can understand all these inputs and provide, some kind of valuable output. As I got into it, super deep topic even way back then, 20 years ago. But I realized at the time two things. One, like AI then was just really like a complex decision tree thing, which didn't seem that like interesting. It was nothing like the generative AI that we deal with now. And then two, there really was nothing turnkey. Like I was going to have to truly be like a data scientist, AI expert at the time to like try to develop anything that was usable. So there was nothing I could plug and play to take advantage of. And and at that time that like I had interest in AI, but it just didn't seem like there was something I could really sink my teeth into. And that's really progressed in such a insane way to where we are today, where we now have solutions that are truly like turnkey. I can go out and deploy and enable something and start using things. And that's really gotten me excited since, kind of the last reInvent and some of the announcements we've had around with like Q and Bedrock, to go learn by doing, right? Like you can read about this stuff forever, but it kind of, for me at least, doesn't stick until I try it and bump into the sharp edges and see what it's capable of. So I went out and was inspired to really start trying to build something that could enhance what we do. And that's where we are, kind of where I am kind of with my mentality today.
Yeah, I think it's really wild how like you're saying with turnkey LLMs, generative AI, the barrier to that like iterative testing and kind of playing around and finding and validating use cases. You just took everything that was involved like beforehand and just turn it into something where now you got an input prompt and you can start tweaking and you could start playing and you can start identifying what those opportunities are. It's way cool. I'm curious if like with the LLMs and everything that's available now, like just question for the audience too, what are you folks kind of finding as a cool use case maybe you weren't expecting with any of the LLMs that you might be playing with? Are you using it in your personal life or using it with work? Have you found something where you're like, wow, this is either funny or entertaining, or just taking a little bit of load off your plate? I really like the one where you can input like ingredients and different foods and stuff like that and tell it to come up with a recipe, which is kind of cool. I'm not sure I'm always trusting of those, but I'm curious, Adam, if there's anything that you've kind of found with the LLMs like that just kind of was like, whoa, this is cool.
Yeah, one practical and one funny. The practical element is I'm not a great coder. I can read code and I can go like pull code from websites to like kind of cobble something together. But man, like the generative AI stuff has made it to where I can provide in just normal readable words what I want to accomplish, and it can output code that gets me like at the very least 90% of the way there, and then I can take that and kind of work with it. So that's been a game changer from just a productivity standpoint when I'm trying to make scripts to do certain tasks or function. So that's more on like the practical side. The fun side though is and I joke kind of with my wife about this too, but like, when you're trying to write a response to an email and maybe you're passionate about it, right? Like, oh, like, I definitely don't want to do that. And you have this really like visceral reaction to whatever it is that you're trying to write. Well, now with generative AI, you can put that in there in your words and say, hey, can you make this professional? Or can you make
Yes.
this, more polite or whatever it may be? And it'll take the tone and it'll still convey what you're trying to convey, but it'll totally change that. So I find it very useful for stuff like that too.
Yeah, totally. And I think we got a couple good examples we'll run through that we've come across where sometimes you know what you want, and then you can have the tool kind of add in the second layer, where I like to be able to have it, say, hey, give me some additional probing questions for whatever this thing is that we're trying to do, and just offload that and let it come up with some of those pieces. So we'll share a couple of examples of where that fits, within FinOps in a couple of minutes here. But also want to just call this one out here too around using it as a coding assistant, like Adam mentioned, and then for a lot of this data analysis stuff that we're doing, where we could take big data sets and we can use tools like Python to manipulate those, put them into data frames, maybe extract stub strings from, things that I have. We just did an example like this with someone recently where they were trying to figure out, what percentage of optimization opportunities they had that were maybe in like non-prod accounts. So took a big list that we had with all the different linked account names and said, hey, if you see a substring in there that matches QA, dev, test, R&D, non-prod, something like that, flag it with, some sort of marker in a new column, and then you can create, kind of groupings based on that. But again, being able to work off of like pseudocode there, where you can get to that outcome and that result very, very quickly. It's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah, agreed. I think if it's okay with you, John, I think kind of setting up or a little bit before we talk about some of what we've built to make our lives easier, if we have time to go through kind of a short landscape of some of the offerings that we have and maybe what me and you are seeing for optimization strategies inside of those buckets?
Yeah, that's a great place to start.
So, yeah, for me at least, the way I see it, kind of our offerings from AWS fall into four major buckets. I call the first bucket self-hosted, um, but this is where we see customers just deploying their own instances. So these are the accelerated compute instances, your P4s, P5s, things along those lines. And then they're really doing a lot of it themselves, right? They're training their own models, they're running their own stuff, and this is powerful, right? They have the absolute most customizability and the most flexibility. Also does require the most expertise, but they run these big environments, and they've got a lot of GPUs out there, and it can in some cases be costly if they're not doing it in an efficient way. So inside of that bucket, some of the levers that at least I'm seeing the customers that I work with utilize are, one, kind of the lowest effort one is savings plans. If the workloads are going to be staying around for at least a year or up to 3 years, committing to a savings plan is an easy way to save some bucks. So that's like the one major lever. The next one that I'm seeing is instance scheduling. So if there's the ability to run these instances while they're doing their training, and then they don't need them, for certain times of the day or certain times of the month, they can, turn them off. That's a big benefit in the cloud, right? When you don't need it, you don't have to run it and pay for it. And then the other one I'm seeing right now is people are starting to lean more heavily into GPU monitoring. So using things like the CloudWatch agents that can be installed, they can tap into seeing like how much of the GPUs are being used, and then trying to take advantage of downtimes to see if other teams need to run those GPUs. So that this is more of like a using what we've got more efficiently type situation, or getting the most we can out of what we got type of deal. So I'm seeing that also, happening kind of within this self-hosted bucket is a beneficial lever. And then the last tidbit I would throw in this bucket is ODCRs. Seeing a lot of customers use ODCRs to protect this GPU capacity, because it's kind of hard to get your hands on in some cases, because everybody's really diving feet first into it and are wanting to kind of bring it into their business. And customers are using ODCRs, and with ODCRs, you want to make sure that what you're protecting is being used. So as a rudimentary example, for protecting 10 instances with our ODCR, but we're only running 8. Well, when you're protecting 10, you're still paying for 10. So let's make sure you're using that 10. Or if you don't need that 10, let's drop down and just protect the 8 that we're using. So just, again, an efficiency thing to kind of keep an eye on. Are you seeing anything in your world there, John?
Yeah, I think part of that is we're seeing more interest within customers to kind of scale out some of those AI ML capabilities broader than maybe just a single team, where that might have been the case years ago, but now broader interest, and with that comes opportunities to max out the utilization of what is available. So just like you said, if this is not a time constrained type thing, can you run it in off peak times, because maybe you already have some commitment in place for that? How do you max out the utilization of it, and how do you get teams on board with doing that? I think a lot of that comes from places where we're seeing customers too look at internal shared services they were running beforehand. What were lessons learned? What worked well for them there? And can they apply that to resources they're using for these types of AI workloads to also get the most out of it? And we've talked about that a bunch on the show, where it's don't need to reinvent the wheel. And maybe that's a helpful lesson, or something that we've seen that's worked well for folks is if you've run shared services internally before, for whatever the use case is, are there pieces from that you could then apply back over to maybe these ones as they're starting to grow the audience internally, which is really cool. So yeah, definitely agree with seeing that, and all the stuff that normally comes up on the show and in the FinOps world definitely applies there too, where it's observability, monitoring, tracking utilization, making sure that we're getting the most out of all the resources that we have. And then my favorite, sort of Steph quote is, do you need that? Do you need to have everyone have separate resources, or can you converge this stuff together to maximize the value and the return that you're getting back out of it?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think you pointed out too, just like maybe times past, there might have been a small team working on this kind of stuff, and they're the only ones with these type of workloads. but now it's a lot more common where we're seeing the utilization cross business units. And if they can pool those resources to use them in a more efficient way and during off hours, you're just going to get more value for your business. So it's a great way to kind of extend the value of what you're paying for.
Yeah, and you're kind of running through like self-hosted versus other other ways to go through consume and implement generative AI or just AI more broadly with workloads. Do you want to kind of carry us out of talking about like the self-managed stuff into sort of that next landscape?
Yeah, kind of going in order from like the most self-managed to the most like kind of fully managed. The next chunk would be Sagemaker. So at AWS, we have a suite of tools that fall into the Sagemaker umbrella. This gives you more like still full control over model training, but it has some public models built in for no charge, private models that do have a fee. And this is kind of similar to self-hosted in that you're still paying for like the underlying instances that are running it. So you'll want to think about if you're on demand or savings plan still as your kind of purchase options to potentially save there. But it does introduce some interesting options with potentially using Spot for training jobs, if that makes sense. So this is another like lever you could potentially pull here, or even Graviton. Like Graviton can also come up as can you use those for some of your training jobs or even the underlying instances to run what you need to run. So SageMaker, suite of tools, slightly more managed, gives you the ability still to do savings plans to save some money. There is some like associated storage and things that you would want to consider there when understanding the kind of total cost of ownership, but largely still similar to self-hosted. Beyond that, though, we start getting into like the managed service offerings, and this is where we kind of traipse into Bedrock, and this is the tool ultimately that got this in Q got my biggest interest when I was wanting to build something because I don't need to be an AI expert, right? I don't need to run these instances and train models on the back end and understand how all that works. I can just go and tap into an existing model that may be really sophisticated already and give it some data to make it smarter at a certain topic and start using it, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. But with Bedrock, excellent tool. It's managed service. You can pick from some excellent like foundation models on the market, interact with it using an API, and its pricing is also on demand, but they have like provisioned where you can kind of buy chunks of tokens for a given month or 6 months to save money. So there's like different pricing models there that you'd want to think about if you're using Bedrock in a regular way. So that's kind of one place or one price point to think about how you would save money on Bedrock. Is do we just want to do on demand? We're very which is great if you have very fluctuating usage. On demand may be your best bet, but if you're going to have really consistent usage and you've deployed a tool, think about provisioned. Could save with a more kind of consistent usage and $1 per unit. But the other element to a managed service like Bedrock is that it's using, especially if you're tapping into using a knowledge base, it's going to be using some kind of vector database. So there's like additional cost in connecting to that. Natively, it uses OpenSearch serverless, but you can tap into ones that maybe they're already running in your environment, like Aurora, MongoDB, Pinecone. There's some other ones. And I call that out on a call like this, not to get too deep into the weeds, but for my FinOps folks here and other folks trying to truly capture all the costs of running something like this. If you were to search for just those Bedrock line items, you might miss that we've got this huge MongoDB or Redis, instance running somewhere that you're not folding into the kind of the total cost of running this full Gen AI. So it's important to think about that when you're putting together, or at least mentally, where all these costs are. And I'll kind of pause there, John, before I jump into Q.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great overview, and it's just a reminder, I think, of two things. One, whatever services you're using, make sure you're getting familiar with the different cost dimensions and different dimensions that are shown on the pricing page there to help better understand it. But also a lot of like kind of our normal FinOps practices. are the same things that apply here too. Look at the different units and the cost drivers for the workload, and help to understand, which one of those are going to be probably more fixed, and then which ones are going to be more variable. If I'm running, a big public service that, is maybe having a lot of input output tokens with Bedrock, I understand that that's going to be a more variable cost. And maybe I've got, RAG database that's going to be sitting on the back end that, kind of tracking that cost maybe a little bit differently, and looking at both of those components side by side and anticipating how it's going to grow over time. So again, like not different than the things that, I think the folks here are used to doing. It's just a reminder to look at it and explore all those different pieces and kind of follow up on making sure that you're accounting for all the supporting costs besides just, tokens in and tokens out for like a Bedrock use case.
Yeah, definitely got some more things to talk about the supporting costs, but wanted to touch on the fourth kind of bucket that I think about all of these generative AI tools in. Is the last one we have is Q Business. This is the one that was announced at this past reInvent. It's a fully managed, AI chatbot service. So you're not picking your model, you're not doing any of that. It handles all that behind the scenes, and you can also, again, still give it data sources to make it specialize in something. And its pricing model is a per user per month, and then indexing per hour. In my use with Q so far, the user per month, if you don't have a ton of users using it, that part is pretty easy to predict. It's just kind of a flat number per user per month. The indexing can be variable though, because it's depending on how much it's ingesting. So it's really important when you're setting up something, and data is what makes these things excellent, right? If you have a good data source to feed into something like Bedrock or Q, you can really make a chatbot that specializes and is excellent at a certain topic. But you want to make sure you're giving it only data sources that it needs with not a lot of extra fluff in them. Because if you're giving it data with a lot of extra in it, you're going to be indexing or paying to index things that maybe you potentially don't need in there, right? Because keep in mind, like for things like Bedrock and Q, like the foundational model is already there. It's really strong. It's really intelligent. We're just giving it extra data so that it can be a little more savvy or like a subject matter expert in a particular topic. And that's, for me at least, what was most inspiring about these tools and what encouraged me to go and build something that specializes in FinOps is that I realized, okay, great. I can just kind of collate a bunch of excellent resources, throw them at one of these models, and now make a chatbot. That's really awesome at something. But before I kind of get into what we built there, you mentioned earlier, like the related services. And that's important to quantify, especially again, for those of us that are trying to understand the full total cost of ownership around some of this stuff, is that there are other costs beyond just the compute and the models that are running. Some things to think about are storage. Like, is the data that we're pulling, does it live in an S3 bucket or on an EBS volume or in a database? Like those costs, you'll want to factor in, potentially tag as part of your generative AI workload. Data transfer, right? Is this going across AZs in a certain region? Is this going across regions, right? Do we have a bucket that lives in a different region? Make sure you're aware of the data flows there and what data transfer costs could be related to this. Because a lot of the data that's being accessed in these things are big, right? Data lakes and different stuff are being ingested to do some of this fine tuning. So it can be very meaningful in both the data stored and the data being transferred. The vector database costs, which we've talked about a little bit already, but knowing where those live in OpenSearch or Pinecone, somewhere else like Kendra, these are services that you're going to want to see and make sure they're either tagged properly or if all this stuff lives in a certain account so that you can properly do attribution. And then think about the outputs of this stuff, right? Like whatever you've built, like, are you hosting it on some kind of web platform, load balancer, quick site dashboard? Like what's the output of this thing that you've built, and where does that live, and what is the cost to run that as well? So I call that kind of like wrap up bit there, like related services. And I think those can often get overlooked, but can be some of the most meaningful costs to think about when you're wanting to really quantify this stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's a good call out too, is anticipating the scale that it's going to operate, because it's going to be a big driver between how material some of those costs are in different use cases. Are we expecting, hundreds of inbound requests to this that each are kind of moderate amount of tokens? Are we expecting, millions, billions? Is it predictable? Is it unpredictable? What does that actually look like? And we could start to look at, which one of those components is probably going to have the most variability to it, which one's going to be fixed and which ones do we want to kind of get ahead of. And we do have all those same, belts and suspenders, things like AWS budgets and anomaly detection, that can help add some of the observability to that as well, and keep our eyes on it. But I know even when we were kind of working on, our stack that we're going to share here in a couple of minutes, it was a little bit of a pen and paper exercise to just come up with some estimates over, hey, what do we think this is going to cost based on, the users that we think are going to use it, and, some estimates. And there's some great tools out there to look at, modeling out, some of those things like the token costs, and being able to say, I'm going to estimate, what my user's general input token size is going to be, what the output token size is going to be. And I can at least kind of like, wrap my head around what that cost component is going to look at, and then see, how many orders of magnitude up are my requests going to increase? Is it going to decrease? What does this look like kind of from a practical perspective, using some of the details that we know? And again, don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves there on that one, but I think, especially given, lots of different components that can be parts of these stacks, and it's going to vary based on what your actual environment looks like. A little bit of a pen and paper, sort of exercise, or using things like the pricing calculator can be good ways to kind of wrap your head around which of these cost components and cost levers is the one I should really be prioritizing. And just saying that so that you don't get sort of spun around the axle on maybe one of those aspects that may not be as material for your environment. So just maybe, call it on that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, a big component of what me and John do is, customers are starting to use this stuff in a big way. So we're trying to help them understand those costs and optimize those costs. But kind of separate from that, we had been working on a project together to use generative AI in a different way, to use it to like enhance and make the job that we do together faster, better, stronger. And when last year Q-Business was announced, and when Bedrock added support for knowledge bases, it really inspired me to be able to go and create a chatbot that was a expert in FinOps. So I've been wanting something like that for a long time, because I feel like when a topic comes up, or when I'm trying to research something, like I've really got to go look through the internet and a bunch of different resources to kind of compile all the best practices and all the thoughts into one place. And, it was wasting a lot of time. And if I went and asked some of the public, chatbots out there, like they did an okay job of doing that kind of stuff, but not great, because they were based off of just kind of general public knowledge. I really wanted to build something that could be an expert, and I could feed it resources that, documentation and podcast transcripts and different things, so that it would be an expert in FinOps. And when Q-Business announced, they're released with being able to pull in data sources that automatically gets indexed. And when Bedrock added knowledge-based support where it could do the same thing, like I really jumped in like feet first at creating a bucket and pulling a lot of those resources into it. And at this point, I think I have something like 5,000 or more different resources in there, but I'm pulling a collection of things that matter, right? Like I mentioned, key documentation around a lot of the stuff that we use, transcripts from, say, like our last reInvent chats around cost, from podcasts like this one, like CFM blog news releases as well, so that we can get the latest updates on things. So, because, as we know in this world, right, a news announcement could come out, and all of a sudden that's a best practice for a new optimization strategy. If you're not keeping up with those, news announcements, you may not very well know that's something you should tap into. So what I've done, I guess, and I say me and John have been working on kind of together is creating this chatbot where we feed it these excellent resources, so that now when topics come up, we can ask it a question like, hey, what are the top ways to optimize EC2, or just different things. And it'll give us, if nothing else, reminders or prompts about the types of things that we should be considering about or talking about. And it really kind of jumpstarts, instead of that like hour of doing research on a bunch of sites, it just collates through all that data and gives it to us in one spot, so that we can start, running ahead.
Yeah, and I dropped a link here in the chat. I want to do a couple call outs to a couple pieces that I saw popping up there as well. But yes, this is a great example, I think, of one of those assets that you put in there, which is the CFM playbooks. I I think we've got a couple of
Yeah, the
them up
playbooks
here.
are excellent to both reference for optimization strategies, and that's another one of those resources that I pull into this chat bot so that I can, when I ask it questions about, hey, what's the best ways to optimize Bedrock or different things or SageMaker, like it'll be able to tap into that as some of its knowledge.
And as we start to look at more complex apps where we're not looking at an individual resource type, yeah, you can go through and you can look at each one of those headings, but it's really convenient when we can just sort of describe an app or describe a workload and have it surface kind of all the different areas and all the different facets, and put that in the context of what I'm actually looking for. Like, is it a greenfield workload that's net new? Am I looking at implementing some corrective change? How do I track it as the workload starts to grow? And goes back to one of the questions that came up here, from Alex, which is, what kind of services should you have optimized, before you even try that generative AI workload? And maybe if I'm doing one of those stacks like you described, Adam, where I've got some web servers, I've got some stuff there, before we even kind of deal with, fine tuning the different foundational models we're working with or input output tokens, can look at like each one of like the pieces of the stack and kind of go through, optimize, and do our normal stuff around instance type selection, all that type of stuff as kind of prerequisites. And when it gets more complex,
Well,
go through and do the fine tuning.
yeah, and I got kind of a answer that's the opposite of that question that was being asked, right? Like pre-optimizing can also potentially be a hindrance when you're jumping into generative AI. So let's say you pre-optimize an S3 bucket and you move stuff like down into Glacier or something. But now all of a sudden with generative AI, you realize, okay, hey, I'd like to tap into that data and pull it into my model and start reading and accessing that data hot again, right? I don't need it cold anymore. Well, obviously storing it in something like Glacier is great, from a data storage costs, but by design, it's not meant to be read and accessed very often. So now if it's all of a sudden needing to be accessed super frequently, that could cause, a cost increase that maybe is unexpected. So kind of to the opposite of the question that was asked, like also think about if you're going to be optimizing things, what maybe the use case is now, but the future use case, if something's going to need to tap into or read that data.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, look at the pieces that more predictable than the ones that may have more considerations, kind of given how your workload's designed, or how it might even change over time. Yeah, good call out there. And there was another link that came up here that I wanted to share kind of as we're kicking off this conversation, which is around the quick start. And there's a lot of awesome assets that are out there, both in the community, the AWS community blogs that talk about building, simple apps that are working with, LLM tools like Bedrock or Amazon Q. And they show you some of the great, like, kind of off the shelf libraries that can be used for going through and building these out. And in the case of what Adam and I are describing, we used a model very simple to this that's using, Streamlit, which is a Python library that helps basically manage, kind of all the front end, web interface type stuff. And then we can connect that back over directly to our Bedrock knowledge base and kind of back over to the Bedrock API, so that we could start to work with multiple models kind of in parallel with each other and compare, quality of the outputs that are coming back, as well as the different cost impacts for each one of those. And then looking at kind of all the different cost dimensions that are along with it. So easy way to get started, easier if you've got some familiarity with maybe some of those tools. But I think the other cool part with all of this too is that there's console-based methods for folks to be able to go through and just be able to validate the use case, right? So before making a big investment or trying to build something off the shelf, yourself, you could just do this straight in the console, validate, is this cool? Is this helpful? Is this creating, quality outputs, and still exploring, costs there without having to write any code at all. So use that as kind of a segue into our next piece, where we talk a little bit more about the solution that we put together, Adam.
Yeah, and while you're working on grabbing that, one thing you touched on there that I think is important to think about for folks is, when picking a model, I think tools like Bedrock are really excellent because you can kind of switch out models and try different models really easily. Because when you're evaluating them, like how quick do they reply? How accurate is the reply? How, and what does it cost to get that reply? Like sometimes if I told you for half the cost, you could get an answer that was, pretty much as good, just a little shorter. more concise, maybe not as expanded in detail, like, is that more valuable for your business? And some models are better at different things than others. So I think, like mentally, like locking yourself into one vendor, one model, to me at least, isn't a great approach, because this landscape's changing so fast. And a platform like Bedrock is really excellent because you're getting to pick from some of the top models in the world, and you could try them, just plug and play, right? I could switch one with one line of code, and now I'm trying a different model. So that's been very powerful. And then in the tool that John's sharing here, like behind the scenes, we run our queries or our prompts against two different kind of models, two different platforms to get the output. And that's been really interesting for us to do, because then we see the output from each, and it kind of, for one, provides a sanity check of each other, to where we see, like, are they aligned, or is one saying something that the other didn't? And then it helps us to kind of get an overall, like, better experience. So instead of just relying on one thing, one model, like, we're throwing at two of the best ones that we think, and then looking at the output of each. So that's kind of been a fun approach too, that maybe is a little atypical from just going to your normal, like, chatbot, single model, single site kind of thing, and then getting an output.
Yeah, and I think a couple lessons that were learned with that is that that foundational model landscape changes really fast. We've got awesome new FMs that are available from Claude that we can go through and we could test, that just didn't exist a couple months back, and we don't know how that output is going to kind of perform for our use case, but we could test it. And I think maybe 6 months ago, or maybe a year ago, there have been more conversations from folks around trying to sort of price out how some of those FMs would compare against each other. And now we're seeing maybe a little bit of a change where folks are just taking a more iterative approach, where they're trying these things sort of side by side in line. And that is a benefit of kind of having a little bit of a front end app that can do some of that control for you, where maybe for every 10 inputs, you're testing or piloting like a new FM that's alongside it, and then you can look through and you can find out, is this a quality output that we want to kind of roll out and present to all of our users? But give yourself the ability to kind of do some of that testing sort of behind the scenes, and then roll that stuff out to your broader audience, depending on what that is.
Yeah, and I think, well, John kind of cues up a question. This is the variant that he's displaying of kind of the bot that we've put together, that really has been an asset for what we do, right? It's kind of an extra expert on our shoulder that helps us do what we do faster. One of the big things that we bumped into first are asking good questions. And I think this is true of the whole generative AI landscape. And a funny example that we ran into is if you put in just, what are the top ways to save money? Because in our mind, like, we're thinking, okay, this is for AWS cloud optimization. Like, what are the top ways to save money? Well, we didn't ask that in the question. I just asked, what are the top ways to save money? And in the chatbot, when we tested that one time, it was like, well, make a budget before you go to the grocery store, and some of these other things, right? Like, which are good, like maybe life advice, but that wasn't the answer that I was looking for. So then I had to modify the question, what are the top ways to save money for AWS EC2? So, like, then I'm getting actual answers according to what I'm asking. And it's kind of the genie in the bottle thing, right? Ask the question that you're really wanting to get to. And this is, in a very simplified way, what prompt engineering is. It's making sure that you're asking good questions, context matters, and then you'll get an even better output. Because sometimes it's not a failing of the model, it's just a failing of asking a good question.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the stuff being very iterative too, because we can unpack more value from the outputs as we try and we test things, especially from that prompt engineering side. I'm just going to start off, like, sharing a couple different questions that we have here, and feel free to throw some stuff in the chat if anyone's interested in us kind of putting a question in, maybe something you had top of mind, or you were asked recently about cost optimization. Happy to kind of play around with this and share some of those responses. But we were talking earlier about, like, full stack app optimization. That can be complicated. We've got a lot of different knobs and levers. Here's an example of kind of putting through and describing a workload just in written text and asking it, I've got a Fargate serverless app that I'm running. It's got S3, it's got a CloudFront distribution on the front of it. It's a net new workload. We want to track, some optimizations that, we should be implementing here, and just sort of see what should happen, longer term down the road. And let it come up with, some proposals. And in this case, we're going to get responses back from two different models, so we can kind of compare those and look at them. But it looks at our services that we have, and then it comes back and it asks us some really good probing questions that we should look at in order to be able to optimize each aspect of the workload. And I think this is just a cool example of something where, yeah, those resources are all available, um, but being able to do this, quickly and be able to find out, what are some of those cost levers, and look at things like, network traffic costs for that workload. There was a cool one that came in here around looking for, emergency levers. What if we see a sudden spike? There's one of those denial of wallet attack, or there's something that goes against the workload that's driving it up, or maybe just normal usage. Do I have a break that's put into place and implemented to help me drive down and optimize the cost? So really cool to be able to give it, just plain written text and get a response back. And, thinking about a cool one that we had in there at one point where someone had asked it about, really specific workload where they were doing like XXL scale, JSON deserialization in a Python app. And, it was running in, big horizontal scaling workload. They wanted to know what the optimizations were, and it would come back with recommendations around specific Python libraries that were worth evaluating to help improve the performance, instance types like Graviton that would help be able to optimize and, kind of reduce the overall compute costs while delivering more compute dollar and better price performance. But really cool, because those are complicated scenarios where, you're going to be tapping a lot of experts on the shoulders to sort of find out, different areas to go through and optimize those. But we can get that information back in, matter
And
of
interesting things in here,
7
like
seconds.
the number of events, right? Like how many queries are being performed. That's kind of similar to what I was talking about earlier with the like if on demand or provisioned makes sense. Because for a lot of workloads, on AWS, like if you don't have a lot of requests, or if they're unpredictable amount of requests, then generally on demand makes more sense and is more price efficient. But if you have, a fixed amount of requests over like a certain period of time that are pretty predictable, then that's where you can go with like commitments or reservations or provisioned amounts of things that can be like a savings lever. So thinking about that kind of stuff, these can be excellent prompts to kind of dive into.
Yeah, 100%. I was going to put one in here that's maybe like a little bit different. Instead of asking about, optimizing a specific workload, create a list of questions that I should be asking, engineering leaders about their optimization plan for the next year. And then this is that prompt engineering piece that you're talking about, Adam, where we say, hey, include some additional probing questions for each of these, because our goal is to identify pain points and ways to help them, but also probing into areas that maybe the person I'm talking to isn't even aware of yet. So this is kind of a cool one for us to go through and look at, and I'll let this run for a couple of seconds.
And I like the questions that are lists, right? Give me a list of questions. Give me like 5, give me 3, give me 10. Like I think those are good things when you're putting questions into this to get back stuff that will give you at least a good starting point.
Yeah, exactly. And we'll do that for a lot of things where say, hey, give me a checklist of things that I should evaluate before I implement a lifecycle transition policy, because I want to understand both technical and cost considerations. And again, this is information that we have available in documentation, but getting it kind of surfaced back in that specific context is really a great thing. This was one that I liked, as a response back here, where our question to the engineering leader would be, how are you involving your engineering teams in the cost optimization process that they currently have? And a probing question is, what incentives or goals have you set for the teams in order to be able to drive this cost conscious behavior? I just think that's cool. It's cool to see these lists of questions that can help you maybe engage with different stakeholders. There was another comment we had up here in the chat that I was going to bring back up that kind of made me laugh. Alex talking about using AI to make you sound more human when delivering your messages or your voice. Funny to think about using computers and AI to sound more human, but it can help us relate with these different audiences really well. Like reframe these questions for a developer, reframe these questions for an executive in order to be able to talk to them about optimization goals they're thinking about for their whole line of business. These are just helpful assets, as we're starting to look at, different ways to drive the cost culture as well as optimization activities.
Yeah, it's a great point. Like I get in the weeds so much sometimes that I'm like providing a summary of what I'm working on in a very technical way. Like here's the savings and the data transfer and just all whatever. And that's a great place too, where I can tap into and say, hey, can you summarize this for like a leader or a CEO or CFO, so they can really take it and kind of make it more approachable for that audience.
I'm curious from the folks that are in the chat, like, are there any things that maybe you're struggling with now, or problems you've kind of run into in the past? We've had a couple great episodes about, getting those executive sponsors and kind of driving, optimization culture. But I'm just curious if folks are thinking about any use cases maybe they might use this for building some of those, either engagement mechanisms or questions to ask. Because I think that's maybe something that we don't think about very often. And Adam, one other important lesson learned, that we kind of had from a lot of this was that a lot of times people, when they first use a tool like this, if this is something that you deploy internally with your organization, our first instinct working with these things is to ask it like the question, like, what is this? Or tell me about, something specific, when we have a bigger opportunity to ask it more like context aware questions, that can help us out. And we were, just joking around yesterday. We'd done a customer engagement where we were helping them identify optimization opportunities. And, two of the partners we were working with had this great idea about coming up with a scavenger hunt in the environment. So Adam and I were asking the tool to come up with a scavenger hunt that folks could run to find these optimization opportunities and create it like in a fun theme to get people engaged. And it came back with this whole, pirate treasure hunt themed thing. And, not spending all your gold bullion and coins on, unnecessary wastage in your DynamoDB tables. And it can make, the gamification and kind of the fun part of this, really easy, to deliver. And I think that's, the cool use case, to help a lot of FinOps folks with this. There was another type of question that I wanted to touch on too, and have you kind of give a little bit more detail on, Adam, and that was around some of the validation and probing questions that you were doing as we experimented with different models. And you had a couple of really cool ones in there that would check to make sure that we're looking at current data and, making sure that there were quality outputs for the user. And I was hoping you could give a little bit more background on those and how you did some of that, qualification of the responses.
Yeah, one of the important things to me was making sure the chatbot could like keep up with the latest news releases. And at the prior reInvent, an example of that is we released that Cost Explorer. Instead of just being limited to that like 12, 13 month, that it could go out to 3 years worth of data, 36 months. So one of the test questions I asked at the time was, how many months of historic data does AWS Cost Explorer, display or provide? And, asking most, chatbots that don't have like the latest news releases, it would generally just tell you what it knows from documentation, somewhere 12, 13 months. But with the addition of these like RAG resources pulling in that blog, and now have the context to say like, oh, well, by default, it supports 12 months, but you can optionally and for free turn on to support, 3 years worth of data. And to me, that's huge, right? Especially when it's coming up, in a conversation, or maybe it's a news announcement I didn't even see, right? Because, we're all human. I'm not going to be able to go in detail on every single announcement that comes out, but this tool can, right? It's pulling all of it in. And if a question comes up about Cost Explorer and I ask it, and it now has that resource, like it's tapping into that and giving me like factual and accurate knowledge. So that part was huge. And then on your validation standpoint too, right? If something comes out new that invalidates, something that's old, similarly like with EBS, when GP3 came out, like, okay, well, what EBS volume type makes sense to deploy that's, the most cost efficient? Well, at one point that would have been maybe GP2, but then when GP3 came out and being slightly more cost efficient, like that, makes more sense and becomes the new recommendation. So I think it's very important for staying kind of up to date with these things. And this tool can kind of help do that for me without me having to go read, every thousands of pages of blog articles and stuff every month.
I mean, that's another good call out too. Wanted to put this one up around, good to know the boundaries, and, Eric's comment over here too about balancing like, need, speed to market, and, also, I think governance of the quality of the responses, and making sure that this is valuable to the users, as well as, cost concerns for it. And I think one area that, we've been, touching on a little bit here is what is the use case for, empowering some of these things to, communities. And if you're in an organization and you want to be able to share this stuff out, It is important that the quality of the responses is high enough, meets the bar, it's accurate, and it aligns to your organization. A lot of organizations, may want to use some of these RAG capabilities to fine tune the responses back to their own organizational standards and tools that are AppSec approved internally versus stuff that may not be readily available in order to make it easier for folks. But if there's concerns around being more conservative or interest in being more conservative, there's a lot of powerful use cases to use these things that don't involve just extending it out to the whole organization. And that could be things like you got my gears turning right there, Adam, around being able to summarize some of the content. We had another customer who was using Bedrock with Claude to take some of the content from this Twitch show, as well as reInvent talks, condense those down to 500 word summaries that they were using as an internal FinOps newsletter. So being able to take a new blog that came out and turn it into a snackable bite-sized bit that could get shared out maybe in your internal FinOps Slack channel or through email to the community. Those are cool use cases that a little bit more conservative, where there's some guardrails that are in place, and it's not the same as opening it up to everyone right away immediately. And I think it's just important to think that there's a really wide spectrum of use cases for taking advantage of this technology and using it to do more optimization work, and that doesn't have to always be giving everyone self-service access to it, right? I'm excited to see what
on Eric's question, like speed to market. I think right now a lot of customers are emphasizing speed just to be competitive, and so I'm seeing like maybe a little over indexing on that compared to some of the other levers right now. But the governance bit is super relevant, right? Like early on, another test question that I used is like, what is an RDS savings plan? And those don't exist for everybody that's on the call here, but it will still give an answer at the time that they do exist, and it will say it in a very confident way. So it was like very confidently wrong. It would hallucinate that this was a thing. But with the right documentation, like our tool is an example that would say, okay, well, that doesn't exist, but there are RIs. Here's the kind of the discount structure for those. So I say all that to say, from like a governance standpoint, it's important to understand like the accuracy of answers that the tool is getting, to collect feedback if those answers are bad, and also to be able to adjust and give it maybe data to understand those gaps and say, okay, this thing is not doing a very good job at talking about RDS commitments. Let's give it more resources about those so that it can be better at answering those questions. So I think that's a little bit on kind of Eric's question there of how these things can evolve over time. And then like the other layer of that Bedrock and Q and some of these tools that do really well is it can cite the resources that it got the data from, so that you have attribution. You can go say, okay, well, here's the actual document that this fact came from. And that's going to be another important landscape for navigating some of this.
Yeah. And I'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge, this other one's coming up here about funnier answers and different ways to make it entertaining. Because I know that we've had, a lot of fun experimenting with some of these things, with coming up with different cost optimization, themed songs, either for the holidays. I think there was a good one someone put together. And then I'm a Willy Wonka fan, so I had put together a pure imagination Willy Wonka themed cost optimization song, and those are all just like fun ways to, I think, use this technology that has a lot of different
jokes.
Jokes. Yeah, exactly. That was one of my other favorite ones. The game show of a FinOps person, their favorite game show is The Price is Right sizing. And we just can't be dismissive about the creativity of some of these models, because there's a lot of laughs to be had there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the last things, I know we're getting close here, it's an ever-changing landscape, right? There's new releases, changes in services, new techniques. Like, I think it's important to try to stay up on that stuff as much as you can, so that in this world we can do kind of proper estimates of the things that are going on, and then to pull in the new stuff that maybe is more efficient and more effective for our environment. So it's going to be one of those worlds with any new technology that comes out. You can ignore it and say like, oh, this is just a fad, and it may pass you by, or you can embrace it and really start using it and becoming like understanding of it. to where it's something that can maybe even help you or help your organization.
Great wrap up, Adam. And I know we talked about a lot of different stuff. We're going to go to the secret wizard right now for a recap. I'm going to bring that up on the screen here in just a moment. So let's go back to the episode summary and tips. We got 3 great call outs here. Consider the cost for all the related services. So look at the big landscape. What is our big landscape of applications? And I think another call out that we didn't even really talk about, but we alluded to a little bit is, maybe we're tapping into other resources that are someplace else in the environment that sort of sit separate from our workload. Connecting the dots on all of that, is going to help give us, full understanding of the entire cost implication and different cost components of the workload. Evaluate the use case and test different models. This is all very iterative from finding out what works best for your use case to also taking advantage of the latest offerings that are available, because that's a changing landscape too. And ask it good questions. Ask good questions and find out what the best response are, and find good ways to share and collaborate too. One thing that we found, as we started to mess around and kind of test with this stuff, was someone would enter in, a really awesome question, and being able to let somebody else know that they could use an LLM to do something similar was a great way to share it. And even if that's something that is, just for fun, just for laughs, to make it, a little bit more fun, like creating the Willy Wonka songs, all that stuff. Just, I think it takes something and just add a little bit more fun and a little bit more gamification to all of it, and get everyone participating. But excited to hear if other folks come across like cool use cases, different ways to use this. And thanks, Adam, for sharing all the knowledge and all the background to help get everyone started and give some great next steps to use this even today. Log into the console and test some of those models and see which parts of your FinOps role you could start to leverage with the LLM models that are available right now with services like Bedrock and Party Rock and all the other offerings that easy to get started with.
Absolutely. I hope some of this has been helpful, and in your organization, you'll be able to better understand and really optimize some of these costs.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And we'll be sure to see you next week.
Thanks.